what had happened and what I've gathered just from being a student of history and kind of looking at these kind of things, by the 1980s, well, really by the 1970s, the idea of an evening edition newspaper has started to fall a little bit. The newspaper, the journalists, the news agencies that were putting out the newspapers were starting to lose money by the 70s on the evening editions, okay? So you start to see a scale back of doing 2 papers a day. A lot of that had to do with TV, right? By the 70s, the evening news landscape had pretty much been solidified. There had been evening news in the 50s and 60s, but by the time you get to the 70s, it had become, with the local stations and then the national stations, it had become a part of our culture. And so it just kind of, you don't need the evening edition then. What that does is it opens up the possibility for a channel like CNN, because now there's a hole. Even though people had scaled back on how much they needed, or as a culture we needed an evening edition, we start to see the desire still for news that was more readily available. And you got to remember, this is before the internet, so we weren't able to hop on Google and check the headlines. So we get to 1980, and Ted Turner has this idea of putting on a 24-hour news channel. And in the early years, CNN was immediately from the gates phenomenal at reporting news. They put a lot of money, they invested a lot in reporters internationally and nationally. They were able to cover stories that go more in depth with stories that I don't know why that just popped up. Go more in depth with stories that the evening news wasn't able to do, and the local news stations weren't able to finance. So here's CNN with a pretty decent budget, being able to cover stuff that the other news corporations just didn't have the money to do. And they're able to produce basically what we were getting with the Times and the Post and all that, for a TV audience, okay? And all of a sudden they had better reach than the larger newspapers did, because of the fact that they were on TV, and because you have one organization broadcasting everywhere instead of having to rely on a distribution network of getting the papers out as quickly as possible in all areas of the country, different regions from where the newspaper actually is, as in the case with something like the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times for that matter. But by 1982, it had become clear that CNN was starting to focus on specialized content, or the beginnings of focusing on that specialized content. And that has a lot to do with Larry King Live and the success of Larry King Live. But they started to shift into this idea of doing specialized content, and that's when you see HLN come in. So Headline News becomes the second 24-hour news network, and all the original template for HLN is just every half hour they run through the headlines, and that's it. So you're getting, no matter what time of day it is, if you turn it on at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to get a half hour of just nothing but headlines. You turn it on at 10 o'clock at night, you're going to get a half hour of headlines. You turn it on at 3 in the morning, you're going to get a half hour of headlines. And so it didn't matter what time of day, you're going to get a solid block of headlines that focused on what had happened that day. And what that does, of course, is alleviate some of the pressure from CNN so they can start focusing on the specialized content that they were starting to work on. And for a very long time, it's CNN and Headline News. And I remember somewhere in the early to mid 80s is when we get C-SPAN. And And of course, C-SPAN allows us to see what's happening on Capitol Hill in real time, right? So, and you wouldn't really call that a news network. It's not like it is today. And we only had one C-SPAN. There wasn't like 3 or 4 of them. There was just the one. And of course, ESPN at this point is just getting started. They're getting their stuff together. But anyway, so that lasts for a long time. It's just those two. And I want to say that at some point there was another news network that tried to get going, but it didn't work. And I can't remember for life of me what it was. But throughout the 1980s, while CNN had this monopoly on cable news, what's happening on daytime TV, you start to see in those daytime TV shows during the 1980s, the templates for what we would end up with today as far as these morning time and early afternoon time style shows, right? And of course, I'm talking about Phil Donahue, Sally Jesse Raphael, Geraldo, and then eventually Ricky Lake and Maury, and trying to think, and then you get the extreme and Jerry Springer. We'll get to that in a minute. But it starts off with Donahue, who became very successful and his show was very, and of course we end up with Oprah out of this too. And we'll get to that in a second. But it starts off with Phil Donahue. And Donahue, from what I remember, and there's probably ones before Donahue that I knew nothing about, but what I remember is Donahue was the big one. And basically the show was Donahue would pick a topic. He would bring in experts. He would bring in, if it was something that needed witnesses, or he would bring, people who had seen an event or had been part of an event or had been part of some kind of, whatever the story was. If they had anything to do with the story, he would bring them in. And then sometimes he'd have national figures on there, or he'd have celebrities on there, and he would interview them, that kind of thing. And so Donahue was huge. And Donahue's show, he presented himself as kind of a common sense kind of guy. And in the 1980s, from what I remember as a child, and I may be completely wrong, but from what I remember, there wasn't as much liberal pushback to a lot of the Reagan-esque style values. Now, there was pushback. It just wasn't as much as today. Like you wouldn't see, like you see today, where you have these liberals on TV just talking about how stupid Trump is. You would never see that in the 80s from what I remember. From what I remember, when they would get mad at Reagan about something, you never heard them call him stupid or idiotic. I do remember towards the end of his presidency, they started questioning his mental capabilities, but it was not to the point where we've seen with Trump, and not what we saw with Obama, and not what we saw with GW. Okay, these past 3 presidents. And really, that kind of, and I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but that kind of reporting, that style of reporting, didn't happen until the late years of the Clinton administration, when Fox News has come onto the scene. And we'll talk about the Lewinsky trial here in a minute, because that's basically how Fox News takes over, is because of Lewinsky. But anyway, so you have the Phil Donahue, you have Sally Jesse Raphael, who kind of fills in that section with Donahue as well. And then, of course, Geraldo, when we look at Donahue and Sally Jesse Raphael, were, if you look at them, they were supposed to be the more serious ones. Geraldo was a little bit more sensational. And you can see, if you trace how Jerry Springer actually comes to be, and Montel Williams, and Maury and Ricky Lake, which they all came later. But you can see the seeds of those style shows from Geraldo, because Geraldo was really good at making something sensational, and he really hyped things. One of the biggest gaffes in news history that we hardly ever talk about is Geraldo's huge special on the Al Capone vault, and they hype this thing, and they do this whole history of Al Capone, which some of it was pretty fascinating. But then they get to the point where they open up the vault and it's just completely empty. And so poor Geraldo had to deal with that for a while.